Hello, my name is Julia Krass. It is April 19th, 2023. I am here with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. This interview is a part of the Tidewater Main Street Project. Who do I have the pleasure of speaking to today?
Barbara Wake Holmes.
Okay. And when and where were you born?
I actually was born in Richmond, Virginia. I heard on top of the hill on the way to the hospital, they told me. But we lived, my parents lived in Hartfield, Virginia at the time.
And what were their names and occupations?
My dad was a waterman at the time, and his name is Alvin Wake, which people know him by Billy. And my mother was a homemaker. Her name was Helen Wake, Helen Iverson Wake.
And where did your family live?
When I was just before I started to school, we lived with my great-grandmother in Hartfield, and then my father and my grandfather and one of the carpenters built our house while we were there, and so we live in Wake, Virginia. Actually, the Alvin Wake from Wake, Virginia, that's where we live.
And when did you attend St. Clair Walker?
I think I must have started in 1961, and because at the time there was no middle school, and started in 8th grade. And well, actually, I need to go back. The year before I started the regular high school, they built what we called the Tin Building, which was the annex to St. Clair Walker, and I went there for the 7th grade. So that was from 1959 to 1960. And then in 1961, I started at St. Clair Walker and graduated in 1965.
And so what grades was that for?
8th through 12th grade for high school.
And did any other family members attend St. Clair Walker?
Yes, my aunts, all of them attended, and my dad did too. Although actually my father didn't go because he stopped in 7th grade, but my mother finished there, and my dad's sisters. Let's see, my Aunt Ella, Costella, and there's 6 of them, so I won't name all of them. All of them finished, and my brother, who's younger than I am, the next one to me finished, and the next one after him, younger than he is. So that was Vincent and Alvin. They finished, so a lot of us did.
And when did your siblings? When would they have gone?
When were they there? Well, my brother Vincent started the year after I did, so he had to be 62 in 1962, and then Alvin was 2 years, I think 2 or 3 years later. He actually was in the last graduating class from St. Clair Walker in 1969.
And what are your earliest memories of St. Clair Walker?
Well, earliest memories, one of the things that still resonate with me today is that when we first started St. Clair Walker, one of the things we had to do at the beginning of the year is we had to learn the history of the school. And so I still have little snatches of memory of things that we learned. And then, like, for some reason, 1917 resonates with me. And we knew about Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker was not the principal when he had already retired. Mr. Thurston was the principal then. But I remember being really nervous because you have all these kids coming from everywhere, and we had gone to a little school. But not quite as nervous as I probably would have been because we had gone to that Tin Building the year before and met kids from up the county and everywhere. But the older kids, I was a little hesitant about being around them because, you know, I always thought of them as being very intimidating. Yeah.
What did they tell you about the history of the school?
Well, They explained that Mr. Walker, they talked a lot about him and how he had made it a priority to make our school an accredited high school, because many of the schools for black children were not accredited then. So we learned about some of the teachers who had been there. Actually, one of them was had been the pastor of my church, Reverend Wright. And although I didn't know him at the time, I was too young, and I think he was gone by the time I came along. But he had been the pastor, and so they told us about different teachers and some of the great athletes who had been through there. We had a lot of guys who were very good at baseball. Then also the academic expectations. Some of the people who had gone to the school. In fact, one of them was Dr. Lyman Brooks, who actually ended up being the president of the college that I went to. And he had gone to Sinclair Walker. He had been a teacher there too, I think.
What college was that?
Norfolk State, in Norfolk State University. Yeah. In fact, when I was reading his bio, it said that when he started as the leader at Norfolk State, they only had like 3 or 4 rooms at the YMCA there, and I think they had maybe under 100 students. And when I was there, there were at least 5,000 students when I was there.
What were conversations about school like at home?
Well, school was very important for home, and my mother was one that, there were 7 of us, and my mother was one who, from the time we started the school, before we started the school, my mother pretty much taught all of us to read before we went to school. And my brother and I were the oldest two, so my job was to teach my younger brothers and sisters how to write their names, their ABCs, their numbers, and we did it by drawing on the ground in the dirt. So they learned it that way. And we had games we played that they learned things. But school was, my mother would always get the books. Then you could get your books ahead of time. And so my mother would always get the books from someone who had been in first grade or whatever grade, especially if you started school. Before, they didn't have kindergarten when I started. You started in the first grade. And so she would teach you how to read. So then my job would be, and my brother, we had to do some of what she used to do with us. And so in the summers, we'd read and do number things and all of that. And then when school started, we all, of course, had chores. Everybody did. And so it was that you can't say, well, I can't do this chore because I have schoolwork. You had to figure out how to get it all done. And that would not be an excuse. And so it would at night, my mother would have the younger kids around the table while she sat at the dining room table, and my brother and I would sit in the kitchen and we would work. We would do our work in there. And if you didn't have homework, it didn't mean you didn't do work. You still had to read. My mother's favorite thing was read ahead, work ahead or whatever. And so school was very important in our family.
How did you get to school?
Well, we always had to ride the bus. And at the time, the bus didn't come up to our lane. We lived in a community with, my father's house was a little bit up, was my grandparents' house. And then it was my aunts were across, 2 of my aunts lived across the street, and then another uncle lived beside my grandfather, but we lived a ways up, and so we would have to walk down. The bus stop was at my grandmother's lane, so we'd walk down to the lane and get on the bus there.
What teachers impacted your experience most at St. Clair Walker?
My first year, even though it was the St. Clair Walker Annex, I would have to say it was Mr. Barnett, who was the math teacher. And he taught math in a way that we'd never had math taught to us before. We were used to our teachers, going to the book and, and looking at the problems, reading them, doing them, things like that. But Mr. Barnett did that, but he also did a lot of talking and questioning in math, and he also was very much into competition. For like many of us didn't know our times tables. We knew some of them, but he made it a priority, and so we had to learn our times tables. And so then he would teach us things like how to convert, like the fractions. We could do 12.5% is the same as 1/8, and I mean we learned that right then, and we knew things like the sixths and the halves and the fourths and the thirds, and so you had to learn to convert going back and forth. And we had classes like A, B, and C, so they tried to, how they tried to fool you in school, and it's like, which one's supposed to be the smartest, because they really were tracking. That's what they were really doing. They didn't have heterogeneous classes. And so we figured out, so they tried to trick us, make us think that the C class had to be lower than the A class, but it was the opposite. And so then, B was in between. But Mr. Barnett wanted to dispel that. And so what he would do sometimes, when we had contests, he would do a problem like, he would do decimal problems, multiplication of decimals or division of decimals, and he would call that like at the end of class, like the last 10 minutes, and he would say, okay, he'll put a problem up. And then everybody's working on the problem at the same time. Whoever gets it, they raise their hand first. And so then you score points. Well, he would bring the kids in from the quote-unquote lowest class, and sometimes they would beat the socks off of us because he had some kids who were really good. There was one guy who could just add columns of figures in his head, in that group. And most of those guys in that class were boys. But we found out that really a lot of the boys were like really smart, but they just were always doing like crazy stuff, dumb things that boys do, and so they would get in trouble with the teachers more. But Mr. Barnett, and then he also just made you feel so confident, when you finish. And then so he was in the 7th grade, and then Mr. Proctor was my teacher in the 8th grade, and Dr. Lomax, who was my science teacher. And Dr. Lomax actually ended up being my freshman biology teacher in college. And so I liked the way they taught, and they would always push you harder. They graded harder. The grading scale would be like 90 to 100 A, with theirs would be like 95 or 96 to 100 A, and so they would make it harder for you and to push you. And most of the time, people really responded to that. Then, of course, Mrs. Holmes, who was the history government teacher, and Mrs. Cameron. They were the teachers who were there the whole time. They taught my mother. And Mrs. Cameron, Mrs. Thurston. I would say they were the ones who impacted my schooling the most.
Yeah. So this is kind of a related question. What sorts of role models or mentors did you have in school?
Actually, many of the older classmen, the guys that I thought were the coolest were the ones who had the slide rulers, and they just, because they were so smart, and back then a lot of times the really smart kids were really the ones that people looked up to. And some of our parents had not been that far in school. Well, my mother graduated from school, but my dad didn't, but math wasn't really her forte. But they knew the kids in the neighborhood who were good at math, and so if you had a hard time with some work you didn't understand, excuse me, your parents would ask those kids, they'd come over and teach you how to do it. And some of the kids had parents who had never been to school. Like my aunts and like my uncles on my mother's side, several of them had never been to school because they didn't have schools for them, really, when they went. They just worked on the farm and, made it like that. But and then plus the teachers that I just named, and a lot of the young teachers who came in, Mr. Thurston would hire teachers mostly from North Carolina or Virginia State and Virginia Union, and we looked up to them, and because they were closer to our age, and we talked to them. And they would not only be at school, they'd be at church and in the community, which didn't work too well sometimes if you were in trouble, but yeah.
What memories from class, like lessons, celebrations, examinations, that stick out? Which ones stick out to you?
I think Mr. Lomax used to have us doing the, you call it where you, with the frogs and the fish and things, the dissecting and stuff. And so Mr. Lomax would have us doing those kinds of things and making the drawings. And then also he would just give us a little bit more than what was in the book, and we just thought that was something that he would trust us to learn more than what was in that book. Also, my brother and I used to talk about Mr. Prater, because Mr. Prater taught us like really the regular math, but really practical things. One of the things that he taught us, my brother learned how to do taxes in 8th grade. He taught us how to do, how to read the meters. At the time you had the gas meters, and how to figure out your parents' bills and that kind of stuff, and how to write checks, because many of our parents didn't have the experience of checkbooks and things like that. Taught us how to balance the checkbook. And also, I loved literature, and I had a teacher named Miss Scarborough who was really good at that, and Miss Cameron taught French. And she loved literature, and her thing would be sometimes come in the room and like on a snowy day or something before she started teaching, she'd go to the window and start quoting poetry and stuff about the weather or whatever. And then Mrs. Holmes, we didn't have, there was no Black history in the books. Mrs. Holmes taught us much of the Black history, especially the local history. Like there's a history marker up there with Irene Morgan by the courthouse. Ms. Holmes taught us about that when we were in school. I don't know if you know about Irene Morgan. But Irene Morgan was a woman who was from Gloucester, and she was on the Greyhound bus, and she had to give up, they tried to make her give up her seat on the bus when they picked up a white couple, and she refused to give up her seat, and they tried to arrest her when she got to Saluda, and this was in 1944, I believe, and she actually tore up the warrant or whatever, the arrest thing, and threw it at the man and kicked him, and they dragged her off and put her in jail. This was right in Saluda, and back then the jail actually was like the ones you see on TV where the people talk through the bars in the window. It was like that, and so she got word to her family. They came and bailed her out. But Miss Holmes, and the other thing she taught us was how to fill out. Then they had the where you had to pay poll tax, and you had to fill out this blank piece of paper. It was 7 questions. You had to know what the questions were in order, and then you had to write the answers to them. So she taught us that in the class. And so our teachers taught us many academic things, but they would always take time out at least once a week, and they just would talk to you about life and some of the things that you were going to face and how to handle them, And so not only did your parents talk to you, but our teachers did. A lot of them did that.
What do you remember about lunchtime, like the food, the cafeteria workers?
That was much better than it is today. We had homemade dinners, meals. The best meal I would say would be they always did the special turkey dinner and before Thanksgiving and before Christmas. And they actually had the turkeys back that they were cutting the slices off, and they had homemade rolls and apple pie and chocolate cake. And so and some of the people who worked in the cafeteria were our parents, like Mrs. Anna Wake was one of the people who worked in the cafeteria. And then a lot of times there were people that they knew, the kids, like if they were especially a lot of kids in the family, 10, 12 kids in the family, sometimes those ladies, if they had leftovers, they would make sure they had extras. And if there were kids like my cousin we said he was just greedy, he would always want more. And so at the end, he knew that he could go up and get another helping. And so the food was really good, and we had fun talking at the tables. And then we had food that, one of the things like you won't find today is, like, I remember one of the meals they would have is like navy beans and biscuits and, fried chicken or baked chicken and stuff to go with that. They had those kind of meals.
That sounds really special.
Yeah.
So describe your experiences with May Day and other special events on campus or at school.
Okay. Well, May Day started when we were in elementary school. And it was they would start really planning for May Day around maybe February, because you'd have to learn the dances, or how to wrap the maypole, which I don't know why it was difficult, but we sure messed up a lot of maypoles. But anyway, and then our parents were the ones who sewed our skirts and tops and things like that. And then, of course, you couldn't go to the store and buy different color shoes. Then you actually painted your shoes and things like that. So you'd have to paint the yellow shoes, the green shoes. And so then we'd come up here, and it'd just be exciting because kids from all over the county would be there. And they used to have things like a picture booth. And so we have pictures from when my mother would have us go in the booth and take pictures with them, and just the dances and meeting people. In fact, I met my dad's aunt was a teacher here in the county, and I actually didn't know her when I was a kid, and that's the first time I met her. It was at May Day.
Really, everyone came. Can you describe some of the assemblies and extracurricular activities you remember?
We had assemblies every month in high school, and elementary school too, but they called it junior league in elementary school. And usually each grade level was in charge of it, or the student council would be in charge of it. And so it varied. Sometimes it was in the entertainment. Mostly like the holidays, it would be entertainment. Sometimes we would have speakers to come in to talk to us, and usually, a class would have to do some kind of presentation, maybe poetry or some kind of reading or something from the band or the choir. But the other things they would teach, talk about decorum, how and everything, to make sure that when you went out in public, you didn't act like you had no manners and things like that. Yeah. So, but and the other activities, of course, we all were enrolled. My family is very athletic, so I played basketball. My brother did. In fact, we all lettered in basketball, and my brothers played baseball, and my sister played softball, and and then I was in the student council and the library club, the French club. Pretty much, I was in a lot of things, you know, and my friends were. Mm-hmm.
What were some of your biggest accomplishments when you were in school?
I think my academic achievement, because my mother, it was very important for my mother, and so I pretty much always got good grades. For one thing, you didn't want to not have good grades and have to go home. And so and then plus my friendships that I made in school. A lot of my friends are still friends today, even though we don't see each other that often because we live in different places. But I would say my academic achievement, yes.
Were there any tough times?
I can't think of any particular tough times, except, you know, one tragedy that happened when we were there. We had two things that happened that was really tough for the whole school. We had one of the young men was playing with a gun, and he doing that Russian roulette thing, and he shot and killed himself with doing that. And then we had a young lady who had gone out really kind of against her parents' wishes. She, you know how you go to someone else's house and then you kind of like tell lies to both of your parents, and she went with them. They went out and it was snowing, and she actually was killed in a car accident. So that was very sad. And that was pretty much. And I do remember when Mr. Walker passed away. That was something. He passed away when I was my first year. Yeah.
How did the school community react to that sort of tragedy?
Everybody always, they pulled together, surrounded the family, because both of them were only children. They were the parents' only child. So pretty much everyone just tried to pull together. They helped each other out and their friends, you know, just the community always was like that.
What regional or national news do you remember hearing about while you were school-aged?
One exciting thing was when we started when they had the launches, and we actually, that was one of the things they would do is put the TV in the auditorium, and we'd all watch the launches in the auditorium. We also, when they would have, if they had debates or some important thing, we in the school, as a school, we watched it and discussed it. The other thing was, of course, I remember I was sitting in government class when President Kennedy was assassinated, and I remember that as being really, really sad. Everybody was really, really upset when that happened. And mainly things, and then if whoever was president, that was something we discussed. We looked at that together as a school, discussed it. And Ms. Cameron always had everything up on the bulletin boards about that. And so.
So y'all were very aware of the news, and like it was something you talked about at school.
Right. We actually had current events was an assignment each week. you had to bring in an article, and couldn't, and she would, and the teachers would say, do not bring any killings and stabbings and stuff. Has to be some news, you know, like this. So yes, we were very much aware.
What do you remember about hearing news about integration nationally and in the state?
Because it didn't really affect me per se at the time, because actually I started the school, I was in first grade when the 1954 decision came down. Of course, that year, and no one really talked about anybody doing anything at the time. I didn't hear my parents talk about that per se as affecting what was already going on, and everything remained status quo. I started talking about it more when I was in high school, that it was coming, because my godbrother was one of they called them the Middlesex 13, and my godbrother was one of the Middlesex 13 who went to desegregate the schools. He and my brother were like brothers, you know, they were really close. And that was heartbreaking for him because he had to leave his friends. And I remember their bus they would ride their regular buses to the school, but then there was a bus that all of the kids who were going to the Middlesex High School, or some of the kids went to the elementary school, the bus would take them and drop them off. And I saw it through their eyes, although Norman it was pretty traumatic for him because he doesn't talk about it today. And he would just say things here and there, now and again, but now and then. But my brothers would be, my younger brother was the first one who went there, and he played on a football team too, which was new for him because none of the black schools had football teams because it cost too much money to field a team, and so parents didn't have that kind of money to do that. And so so for him that was new. He always liked football, and he played you know, football with our cousins and his brothers and everything, but that was his first organized venture into football. And so, but I don't remember too much about what happened to him because I was already in college, and so I don't know too much about the day-to-day things about the football. I do know that he was taking trigonometry, and he was having a hard time, and and the teacher wouldn't help him. And so in fact, he said there were only 4 people in his class, but the teacher didn't help him. And so my brother, who loves everything math, my older brother, and he's always been good in math, he would come home on the weekends, and because he was in college too, and he would come home on the weekends and teach him how to do it. Mm-hmm. But as far as me being directly involved, I really wasn't.
Do you remember what you thought as a kid, like observing integration through the experiences of like other kids you knew?
Yeah, I wondered how they coped at times, because there was one of my classmates, her name is Faye Lewis, and she went to Middlesex High School too, and I wondered how she was coping because Faye had kind of a, how you put it, firecracker temper. So And she was like weighed like 95 pounds, but she was always like, getting getting into some situations. So I don't know how it really panned out for her. She would say things sometimes, but not really. They didn't really talk to us that much because we didn't see them that much because of the way the bus schedules were.
And in what way did your experiences at St. Clair Walker affect your life socially, educationally, civilly following your graduation?
Well, I think the school really did a good job of preparing us because of not only the academics, but because they talked to us about life and how to navigate certain situations. And plus, our school, a couple years before I graduated, as far as being prepared academically, we got a new program called a new advanced studies program, and where we read some of the college literature and did some of the math that would be expected in college. And so because I had, we did Dante and all of those, that kind of stuff like that, and some of the philosophers, and we did that. And so when I got to college, it actually was pretty easy because I had already had it. And then we also had a lot of writing. Writing is usually an area that really kind of gets people, and we had teachers who really taught us a lot of writing. Big into history, too. We had strong history teachers. And so for college, we were prepared, and then just certain things that we just knew about life because our teachers talked to us along with our parents, and if you're in church, your pastors and everything. So I think they did a pretty decent job of helping us with expectations, even though I think because we still lived a rather sheltered life, there was a learning curve in some areas, yeah.
Can you tell me what that learning curve was like at all?
Well, I think we looked at things sometimes a little bit more simply than what life really was, like as far as like trusting people and thinking that people are going to do something because they said they were going to do it, or trust them with just confiding in people, and you find that people may not have kept your what you told them, like people here would do, and because they wouldn't, they would really live up to what they said.
What was your occupation after you finished school?
I was actually, for a while, I worked in the hospital, and then I took a year off from school and worked in the hospital, and then I just went back and I became a teacher. Yeah.
Where did you teach?
I taught in Fairfax County for 25 years, and then when I retired from there, I taught in Prince George's County for 10 years. And, well, I started in Washington, D.C., 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, that's up. So these are some questions about Cook's Corner, because that's one of the things we're looking at, especially. What are your earliest memories of Cook's Corner or of hearing about Cook's Corner?
Well, I really didn't frequent that Cook's Corner that much, because the only thing I remember, there was a Mr. Jackson had a store, and it was they call them beer garden there, and during that time it was really considered to be improper for women to go in there. And then my mother would go in there if it was like the daytime when his wife was there, and because they also sold sandwiches and things, she would go in there to get a sandwich, but would not go in there to sit down or anything like that. But she didn't go there that often. She didn't let us go in at all. So, and then there was another, more, I guess you would call them a juke joint across the street from there. And that was what we call Cook's Corner, really, that place. And of course, we weren't allowed to go, so I don't know very much about it.
Do you remember Mr. Butler Harris's outdoor movie?
No, I don't remember that at all.
Do you remember the baseball field?
I don't know which one they mean, because my dad actually was a really good baseball player. He actually played, when he was in World War II, he actually played in the military for the military team. And when he came back, there were several teams, and they had baseball fields in the lower part of the county where we lived, and they had some around the Cook's Corner area and around this area, the Locust Hill area. So that's the only ones that I know. I don't know about any others.
What do you remember about Herman's?
Well, I did go there, but but I went there pretty much maybe the last 3 months of high school, because I wasn't allowed to go anywhere before. And so, yeah, just that they would play music, you could get food, you go in there to dance and just have a good time. Yeah.
Do you remember any of the music or any of the dances you do?
Oh, I think what was out there, the jerk, hand dancing, the music were, a lot of one of my favorite ones was this song, Knock on Wood, and I'm trying to think, James Brown, people like Chuck Berry, Smokey Robinson, all of them.
What do you remember about other Cook's Corner establishments through your own experience or other people's experiences?
I don't really, because we lived in the lower part of the county, I don't know a lot about Cook's Corner because of having the juke joints, and because my mother was pretty much a pretty proper person that she wouldn't, allow us to go, and she didn't go there either. My father would go up there, he and his buddies. They would go up and have a beer or whatever and smoke and whatever, probably lie. They kind of tell each other lies, yeah.
And then, is there anything else that you'd like to share with people or that you think I've missed?
Well, I was thinking back to my brothers and sisters. It seemed that we enjoyed high school a lot more than my younger siblings did. In fact, my youngest one, he absolutely hated school. And whereas we absolutely loved school. We were in a lot of different organizations, and I think because we didn't have to navigate, we just navigated regular stuff. But in integration, you got to navigate regular stuff and whatever the situation is for when things are, when things integrated. And so, but I mean, we actually cried when we were leaving school because we really missed it. We were doing crazy things, like loony things, like going to our lockers and looking at them and crying, oh, we're gonna miss this, and all of that. And so, I thought that our teachers really cared about us. And we thought that they were, I mean, not all of them were great teachers, but but they still were people that we trusted, and they made school fun and safe for us.
Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah. And you said your name is Julia.
Yeah, I'm Julia.
Yeah, that was my great-grandmother's name.
Oh, wow.
Julia Middleton. Yeah.
Is she from around here?
She actually was from Gloucester County, and she was my great-grandfather's mother. His name was Addison, and her name was but she was from, her family was from Gloucester.
That's great.